Story 1. The Whispering Pines. There's a stretch of forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the trees grow so close together that even the brightest moonlight struggles to penetrate. Locals refer to this part of the woods as the Whispering Pines due to the strange, eerie sounds that seem to resonate from the trees after dark. It was here, years ago, that a group of hikers experienced a terror that changed their lives forever. It started as an innocent camping trip. 4 friends, Jim, Caroline, Luke, and Sarah, set out to explore a lesser-known trail for a weekend getaway. The forest was thick and untouched by modern civilization, a perfect escape from the hustle of their everyday lives. On the first day, everything went smoothly. The weather was clear, and the trail, though challenging, was exhilarating. By late afternoon, they set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, telling stories and laughing, the warmth of the flames chasing away the cold of the deep woods. But as the fire began to die, a strange noise cut through the stillness of the forest. It was a low, whispering sound like the wind blowing through the trees, but more deliberate, almost as if the trees themselves were speaking. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Luke shrugged. "Probably just the wind." But Jim wasn't convinced. He stood up and looked around, his eyes scanning the dense forest. "It doesn't sound like wind," he muttered. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and now the others heard it too. It seemed to be coming from the trees, the pines swaying gently despite the fact that there was no breeze. As the whispering intensified, it became clear that it wasn't just random sounds. Words, faint but unmistakable, floated through the air. "Leave!" Caroline clutched Luke's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" Before anyone could answer, the campfire flickered violently, as if a gust of wind had blown through, though the air was still. Then, without warning, the fire went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they scrambled for their flashlights. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent, the voices sounding angry now. Jim grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, his heart pounding. Something moved just beyond the light, a shadow darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "See what?" Luke replied, his own voice cracking with fear. "There's something out there," Jim insisted, backing closer to the group. And then they saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, its body blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding pines. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could see its eyes, glowing, piercing eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. "Run!" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But before anyone could move, the figure let out a low, guttural growl, and the whispering turned into a deafening roar. The trees seemed to come alive, their branches swaying violently, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Without a second thought, they grabbed what they could and ran, their footsteps echoing through the forest as they fled deeper into the woods. The whispering followed them, growing louder and more menacing with each step. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their car, miles away from the cursed forest. To this day, none of them can explain what happened that night. But they all agree on one thing. Something lives in the Whispering Pines, and it does not want to be disturbed. Story 2. The Eyes in the Dark. In the heart of the Pacific Northwest, there is a vast expanse of wilderness known as the Blackwood Forest. The dense trees and rugged terrain make it a popular spot for adventurers, but there are parts of the forest that even the most experienced hikers avoid. One such area is known as the Hollow, a dark, foreboding section of the forest where strange and unexplainable things have been reported for years. It was in this part of the forest that a young man named Eric had the most terrifying experience of his life. Eric was an avid hiker and had spent countless weekends exploring remote parts of the Blackwood Forest. He prided himself on being fearless and had heard all the local legends about the Hollow, but he didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. So when he found himself camping alone near the edge of the Hollow one summer night, he wasn't concerned. In fact, he was excited. The first few hours of the night were uneventful. Eric sat by his campfire, enjoying the solitude and the sounds of the forest. But as the night wore on, he began to feel uneasy. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, had faded into an eerie silence. He shrugged it off, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But then he saw them. Two glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness, just beyond the light of his campfire. At first he thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But as he stared at the eyes, he realized something was off. The eyes were too high off the ground, and they didn't move like an animal's would. They just stared at him, unblinking. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound brave. There was no response. The eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, unwavering. Eric stood up, his heart racing, and grabbed his flashlight. He shone the beam in the direction of the eyes, but to his horror, the light didn't reveal anything. The eyes were still there, floating in the darkness, but whatever they belonged to remained hidden. Panic set in as Eric backed away from the campfire, his mind racing. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but there was no logical explanation for what he was seeing. He could feel the weight of those eyes on him, watching his every move. Suddenly, the eyes moved, darting to the left, then to the right, circling his camp. Whatever it was fast. Too fast to be human. Eric grabbed his backpack and ran. He didn't care about leaving his gear behind. He just wanted to get out of the forest. As he ran, he could hear something following him, its footsteps heavy and fast, keeping pace with him no matter how hard he pushed himself. The glowing eyes appeared again, this time ahead of him, blocking his path. Eric skidded to a stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, his heart pounding in his chest. But the eyes followed, always just out of reach, taunting him. By the time Eric reached the edge of the forest, the sun was beginning to rise. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving him alone, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. He never returned to Blackwood Forest after that night, and to this day, he can't explain what he saw. But he knows one thing for certain. Something watches from the shadows in the hollow, and it is not of this world. Story 3. The Man in the Trees. In the deep forests of Maine, there is a small town called Hawthorne, nestled between rolling hills and dense woodlands. The people there are used to the isolation, but they also know better than to wander too far into the forest after dark. There are stories of strange things happening in those woods, stories that most people dismiss as superstition. But for one family, those stories became all too real. The Anderson family had lived in Hawthorne for generations. They owned a cabin deep in the woods, about 5 miles outside of town. It was their getaway, a place to escape the pressures of everyday life. But one summer, their peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare. It started with small things: knocks on the door late at night, strange noises outside the cabin, and the feeling of being watched. At first they thought it was just animals, maybe a bear or a coyote. But the noises became more frequent, and they began to find strange symbols carved into the trees around their cabin, symbols that looked old, ancient, like something out of a forgotten time. One night, as the family was sitting around the fireplace, they heard a loud knock at the door. Mr. Anderson grabbed his rifle and cautiously approached the door, but when he opened it, there was no one there, only the dark, silent forest. The next night, the knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. Mrs. Anderson swore she saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching them. But when they shone a flashlight in that direction, the figure disappeared. The family was on edge, but they tried to ignore it, telling themselves it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them. But then, one night, they saw him, the man in the trees. He was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face that was pale and twisted like something out of a nightmare. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes locked on the cabin, unblinking. Mr. Anderson fired a shot at him, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if he were studying them. The family fled that night, leaving everything behind. When they returned with the police the next day, there was no sign of